Hello, and welcome to the Dance Physio Podcast, a podcast designed to explore ideas and foster discussion around dancer health and wellness. We're here to challenge the status quo, bridge the gap between dance science and the studio, and help change the landscape of the dance industry for the better. I'm your host, Erika Mayall, a dancer turned physiotherapist who is deeply passionate about leaving the dance world better than I found it. I'm so glad you're here. Let's get started. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Dance Physio Podcast. I am your host, Erika Mayall. Before we get started today, I just want to say another huge shout out and thank you to everyone who has sent in donations from the Support the Podcast link at the bottom of the show notes. For those of you who don't know, there is a little donation link there. There's obviously never any expectation that people are going to donate, but I've had people request how they can support the show. And recently, there's been more donations coming in. And so I just wanted to say thank you so much to everybody who has sent donations, big or small. I appreciate all of them. Obviously, again, no obligation whatsoever. But if you are so inclined, you can find that link just at the bottom of the show notes for every episode of the podcast. All right, on to today's podcast episode. We are going to talk about starting the season strong or preparing for the start of a new dance season. I do a similar podcast episode to this every year around this time, just as a reminder or for new listeners out there who are not necessarily going to go back through the archives of like years past, what we want to be thinking about and how we can go into this next dance year as successful as possible. I realize that in different parts of the world, the dance seasons are starting at different times of year, but where I am here in Vancouver, Canada, pretty much all studios are starting their season at the same time. So for us, we go back to school after Labor Day, and Labor Day is the first Monday in September, essentially. So this year it's late, and school itself doesn't start until September 8th, and most studios are going to start their classes that week or potentially even the week after that. So some studios let school go back first, and then they start the Monday after. So all of that to say that if you are listening to this episode the day it comes out, or even like within the first few days that it comes out, there's about 2 weeks until the dance season is starting for most studios in my area. If you are somewhere, especially in the US, where I know schools go back a lot earlier, in most places they go back in August, and the dance season has maybe already started, this information is going to be just slightly different, but the main bulk of the information remains the same. Just I'm going to talk about sort of specific timelines a tiny bit. So those might not apply to you as much if you've already gone back. I know we have tons of listeners in Australia, so I'm sorry, guys. This episode is going to make probably no sense to you because you're on a completely different schedule, but bookmark it, save it for when you are starting your new dance season, which is probably sometime in January or early February. Go back, have a listen to it, and it will apply to you more at that point in time. So why is this a podcast topic that I do pretty much yearly? Because I don't really repeat a lot of podcast topics, but this is one that I repeat pretty much yearly. And one of the reasons for that is that we see a pretty significant spike in injuries at the beginning of every dance season. And it's like very predictable in the sense that when dancers return to dance, we don't see it in the first day they go back to dance or even the first week they go back to dance necessarily. We see this increase happen around 4 to 6 weeks into the new dance season. And I can track this based on my clinic kind of volume or booking and clinic notes and things like that, and have noticed that pattern year after year after year, where we see this spike in injuries happen within the first few weeks of the dance season. And it's really predictable. The beginning of September is always pretty quiet in the clinic for us. Like the first week or two, people are just settling back into their routines, getting back to school. And then we see like all of a sudden a really significant increase in bookings for the second half of September and the beginning of October. And it follows the same pattern every year. And although, you know, we love it when dancers are coming to see us in the clinic, this is not the reason we want them to be coming to see us in the clinic. And we cannot handle the volume of dancers that are trying trying to get in and be seen when they're injured at the beginning of a season. So we want to try and minimize those injuries as much as we can. And a lot of times they are preventable when we think about the factors that are involved in why we see this spike in injuries. So there's a couple of reasons why we see this spike. Number one, it's the sudden changes in training load that we see. So we have dancers who have taken the summer off. They have, not been doing as much as they should be. We want our dancers to have an off season. So that's not the answer to this. But we want our dancers to have an off season. They're coming off of off season, and then all of a sudden they go straight back into their regular dance schedule, and they're straight back into 10 hours a week, 15 hours a week, 20 hours a week, whatever it is. Those training loads spike really suddenly. And we know anytime we see sudden changes in training loads, and that's sudden increases or even really sudden decreases in training loads, we are going to see the effects of that in the body. And those sudden increases oftentimes show up the most in tendons. Our tendons take a while to respond to changes in training load. They don't like sudden changes in training load. They have a hard time adapting to that. So these injuries that we see a spike in at the beginning of the dance season are often tendon-related injuries. So we'll see people coming in with Achilles tendon pain or patellar tendon pain or all sorts of other tendon issues, but it is often tendon issues that we're seeing when people are dealing with things at the beginning of the season, and it is almost always related to these sudden increases in training load as they're coming off of having an off season. So that's reason number one. Reason number two, slightly different, but we have dancers sometimes who actually have not had an off season. So we may have dancers who've been dancing really consistently through the entire summer. They've gone to different summer intensives. They've done conventions. They've been doing, whatever it is. And so they may actually be in a little bit of a state of burnout or under-recovered, we often kind of call it. And so if we're coming into a dance season and we haven't had an off season, the body hasn't had a chance to rest and recover, and then we're just like loading more on top of that. And so this is, again, a training load management issue, but it's a slightly different issue in that the body is actually just being overloaded. It hasn't had a chance to rest and recover, which is slightly different than our dancers who have had a proper off season, but then they're being overloaded in the sense that the loading is changing suddenly on them. So it may not be that the load itself is too much. That's not that they're being overloaded in general. It's just that the change in loading is happening too suddenly. Their body isn't able to adapt to that gradually. And then number three, the third reason we see sort of this spike in injuries happen at this time of year is often old injuries that have not been dealt with. And this I see very commonly where dancers have been dealing with something at the end of the previous season. And oftentimes it's something that happened during competition season or maybe end of year shows and that type of thing. And they may be kind of limped their way, sort of literally or figuratively, to the end of the dance season, and they think, okay, I just need some time off over the summer. Like I need to kind of nurse this injury, get through the end of this season, I'm going to have a rest. And the rest is probably useful, but a lot of dancers don't necessarily work on rehabbing those injuries during the summer. So maybe they've thought, okay, I'm just going to rest it and then I'll be good to go in September. And oftentimes their pain does go away because they're not doing anything, because they're resting, the injury feels better. The pain of the injury is gone. And so they're like, okay, I'm good to go. September comes around, it's time to get back into the dance season, and they just go straight back into it because they haven't felt any pain. They assume the injury is healed. But in reality, even if the pain has decreased in an injury, it may not be back at a place where it can tolerate or withstand the demands that we're placing on it. So if it's a muscle injury, maybe it's not back to its full strength and its full capacity and its ability to withstand loading in the same way. So it is not uncommon that we have people who think, oh, my injury was healed and now I've sort of like almost re-injured it, when in reality, it's probably not that the injury was healed, it's that the pain went away, but the capacity of the tissues had not fully recovered to 100%. And unless we're intentionally strengthening and intentionally loading those tissues, they're probably not going to return to 100% if you've just been resting over the summer. And again, nothing wrong with resting, but if you were dealing with an injury, ideally, we would have also been rehabbing that injury and increasing the capacity of those tissues. So if that hasn't happened over the course of the summer or when people have had a rest, then we're often dealing with the repercussions of that in September or when they return to dance. Again, loading changes, we increase the demands on the tissue and discover that, you know what, their capacity wasn't as high as we thought it was. And so then we're having to deal with the rehab piece of things, you know, in September or October or whenever it is. So there's not tons we can do about these second two scenarios. So if we have an injury that maybe we just rested over the summer and didn't really rehab, or we haven't had a break at all over the summer, at this point of the year, it's probably too late to really address those things, you know, in a super meaningful way or in a proactive way. We're probably being a bit more reactive to those scenarios, but I still bring them up because maybe that plants a seed for our planning for next year or next summer when we think about, okay, what is it I want to participate in the summer? What am I going to get out of the summer? How am I going to structure my training year? These are things to think about when you know, where the season is starting and what you're going to be expected to do at the beginning of this season. So I want to focus a little bit more on what we do moving forward. So we are where we are. We're a couple of weeks out from the beginning of the next season. How are we going to address things? What are we going to do? What are we going to prioritize so that we can go into this season strong and hopefully avoid injuries, and especially these injuries that occur right at the beginning of the season, because no one wants to be injured right off the bat from the beginning of the season. And honestly, it really does put a damper on your season in the sense that if you're having to modify and aren't able to set choreography or all of these things that can happen at the beginning of the season, it really does have a little bit of a knock-on effect for the rest of the season. So as much as we can go into our season strong, that's going to set the tone for the entire season. So what do? Well, first of all, we want to consider what we're going to do before we actually go back to dance. So in the next, I'm going to call them 2 weeks because, again, if you're listening on the day it comes out and we're in at least my part of Canada, and I think a lot of parts of Canada operate the same way, we have about 2 weeks before we go back. So what are we going to do? What are we going to prioritize? This is a time, especially if you've not been doing much over the course of the summer, so you've really been taking a break and having an off season, and that is totally fine. But right now, we want to start to slowly think about building up our physical capacity. And really what we want to focus on is our cardiovascular fitness and our functional movements or functional strength. So cardiovascular fitness, if we haven't been doing much over the course of the summer, we want to try and build up a little bit of a base before we head back into the season. And so maybe this means purposely going for some bike rides or going swimming or doing some running or jogging or incline walking on a treadmill or rowing or, the options are kind of endless when it comes to cardiovascular fitness, but we may want to go out and intentionally think about training that for the next couple of weeks. This is going to depend on your individual situation and how much you have or have not been doing, but anywhere between 3 and 5 days a week of cardiovascular activity and anywhere between probably 20 and 60 minutes, depending on where you're currently at, what your goals are, and that sort of thing. Obviously, again, it's going to be really individualized, so it's hard to give specific parameters, but we want to look at, okay, how are we building up that kind of cardiovascular base a little bit? The one thing to be careful of is, like we just talked about, tendons don't like sudden changes in loading. So one thing that I see is dancers are like, I'm going to go get into shape before the season starts. And they go and start running every day for 2 weeks or whatever it is. And that is a lot of impact. And our tendons don't always respond super well to that. So we need to be really careful about how much we're overloading some structures in our body when we're trying to build up this cardiovascular base. So if you haven't been doing much in the way of impact over the course of the summer, going out and choosing running every single day as your cardiovascular activity is maybe not the best idea. It could potentially be problematic. So maybe we want to choose a variety of swimming, cycling, rowing, whatever it is. So yeah, that's just to say that like, although we want to build up this cardiovascular base, we do have to be careful of thinking about how our body's going to respond to that, and specifically how our tendons are going to respond to that. We also want to think about having a bit of a base of functional strength. So in an ideal world, and I talk a lot about periodization on this podcast, and if you're not familiar with that topic or sort of exactly what periodization is, I would suggest going back and listening to episode 6, which is all about periodization. I will link that in the show notes for you, because I talk a lot about what the goals are for sort of like preseason, in-season, postseason, off-season, all of those types of things. So in an ideal world, if a dancer is following periodization, they should have been working on just like physical fitness base level things during their off season. So that would be stuff like cardiovascular fitness and functional strength. So in an ideal world, our dancers are coming into the start of a new season with that foundational base. In reality, a lot of the dancers I work with, and especially kind of our like adolescent competitive dancers, they've maybe just been taking a break over the course of the summer. So maybe they've not actually been doing that. So these 2 weeks are a chance to start to build some of that up. Again, going out and trying to do 7 days a week of strength training to make up for, having had a rest over the course of the summer is not going to be beneficial to you. But going and doing 3 to maybe 5 days a week of some functional movement patterns. So things like squats, things like lunges, things like hinge patterns, basic pushing and pulling patterns. So it does not have to be fancy. It does not have to be complicated, but going and starting to reintroduce those functional movement patterns and loading them, but loading them potentially at like, I would call it a moderate level. So again, if you've had a break over the course of the summer, we don't want to come in and try and be lifting the maximum amount of weight that we can lift. But we do want to think about loading the body a little bit. So maybe we start the first day or two with just body weight exercises, reintroduce those functional movement patterns, and then start to load them at a level where we can do, 12 to 15 reps of an exercise for 3 or 4 sets of an exercise. So again, we're not loading heavy. We're thinking more about like the endurance, muscular endurance side of things. Starting to reintroduce those movement patterns a few weeks before we get back into the studio can actually have a really positive effect on our body being prepared for when we start to introduce more technical and more challenging things inside the studio. If you are someone who has been following a kind of or like a periodization model throughout the season, so your off season, you actually were maintaining some base levels of fitness or working on functional fitness, functional movement patterns. Maybe you were in the gym doing some of those exercises already. For the next couple of weeks, you could actually start to layer on some more dance-specific strength and conditioning type principles. So this is where we might start to think about, okay, maybe I haven't been focusing on my turnout muscles, like my hip rotators as much, because you've been focusing more on functional squats and lunges and things like that. So we start to layer in those types of movement patterns. Maybe we haven't been working on our foot intrinsic strength as much, because again, in traditional functional strength training programs, that's not always going to be a component of that. So this is where over the next couple of weeks, we can start to layer in some of this more dance specific strength and conditioning, we can call it, but like kind of strength type things. So for the next couple of weeks, start to think about how am I going to start to increase the load on my body, but not necessarily by going and throwing yourself into a dance class. I get a lot of dancers who like all of a sudden at this point in the summer are like, I haven't really done much this summer. I'm going to go and take a couple of drop-in classes as a way of getting back into shape before going back to their dance season. And I would argue that that's probably not the most productive thing that you can do at this point of the year, especially because drop-in classes are just being taught at a level where they're assuming that dancers are kind of dancing full out and going full out. So you're going to put yourself in that situation. Your body hasn't really done anything for a while, either a few weeks or a few months. And all of a sudden we're asking it to perform at a high level. That is not the most effective way of getting back into shape or starting to like recondition our body. We want to think about these more foundational concepts. So focus on cardiovascular fitness and focus on some functional strength. And if you've been doing those things consistently, then start to layer in some dance-specific strength. All right, so that's kind of for the next couple of weeks. Then the dance season is going to start. It's going to start in September, here at least. What are we going to do, or what are we going to think about when we go back into the studio? Well, in an ideal world, the first, I'm going to say 4 to 6 weeks of the dance season should be treated like a preseason. It should be treated like preseason training. And again, in the dance world, we don't always follow periodization, or more often than not, we're not really following periodization. But even if we're not following a periodized schedule for the entire year, we still really want to treat those first weeks of a new season as a preseason. It's so easy, and especially if you're a teacher, it's so easy to want to like jump back into the studio. You're so excited. You're full of all sorts of new ideas. You've been like picking music over the summer, doing choreography, you have all of these new ideas. Maybe you did some professional development and learned new techniques and new things you want to try with your dancers. It is so easy to get really excited by all of the newness of a new season and jump back in at 100% and try and share all of this with our dancers right off the bat. The problem with this is that their bodies are likely not ready yet for that level. And so we need to really gradually build back up over those first 4 to 6 weeks and treat those first weeks as a preseason where we're building up that intensity and that training load at a much more gradual level. We always talk about sort of this like gradual increase in training load. And for those of you who are maybe not familiar, when I use the word training load, there actually is a podcast episode all about training load. So if you have not listened to that one and you want to learn more about that, it is episode 10, I believe. I will link it in the show notes, but it's all about training load and how we look at it and measure it and all of those types of things. But just as a super brief reminder, training load is a product of duration times intensity times frequency. So how long we are doing an activity for, at what intensity, and how often. And when we jump back into the start of a new dance year, we are generally not going to be able to manipulate the frequency and the duration too much. This will depend a little bit on what type of a setting that you're in. So if you are in a company setting or you have control over like a professional company schedule or more of a vocational training program or something, you can absolutely manipulate those variables. And we see this done pretty successfully in some vocational training programs where they will purposefully put activities that are not necessarily dance-specific activities in the timetable over the first few weeks. So maybe they're doing more educational things on nutrition, on like rest and recovery for dancers. Maybe they're doing, who knows what it is. There's all sorts of things you can put in, but they're focusing more time and attention on some of those things. And then as the weeks progress throughout the beginning of the season, then those classes transition into actual dance classes. So in some instances, we can manipulate the duration and the frequency, and that is super helpful if we can do that. But for the vast majority of dance studios, like community-based dance studios out there, you have your timetable. Parents have paid for a certain number of hours, a certain schedule that their dancer is enrolled in. And right off the bat, they are showing up at the studio for all of those classes. So if we are not able to manipulate duration and frequency, easily, we'll call it, we are left with manipulating the intensity of what we are doing. And so that's what we have to pay a lot of attention to when we think about this gradual increase in training load or gradual increase in load on the body. We really need to manipulate the intensity. And by manipulate, I mean decrease the intensity or gradually build that intensity up. So again, it's easy to come back and be really enthusiastic and really want to jump back in, like right where you left off at the end of last season or with all of these fresh new ideas, but we need to make sure that we are not overloading those dancers' bodies. So some really easy ways of manipulating the intensity of what we are doing. We can decrease the difficulty of what we're doing. The first, 4 to 6 weeks, or what we're going to call our preseason part of the beginning of the year, we really want to focus on technique fundamentals. And I know that sometimes this is a hard sell to dancers, and especially some of those like really, really keen adolescent dancers who just like really want to push their boundaries and gain new skills and increase the difficulty of what they're doing. But the first few weeks of the season is not the time to do that. And in my experience, if we really educate the dancers on why that is the case, so we're going to pull back, we're going to really focus on these technique fundamentals to make sure that we all have a really solid building block and a really solid base of our technique. So that we do not get injured right off the bat, because nobody wants to be injured in the first few weeks of the season, but then also so that we can really accelerate our technique as we push into the more main part of our season. So I often use that analogy of like, a slingshot or something where you have to like pull it backwards in order to get like more force to go forwards, or to get like more force off of the shot or whatever. That analogy often works really well for dancers, where you think, okay, we're going to pull back a little bit. We're going to focus on really honing in those technique fundamentals so that once we are at the point in the season where it's appropriate, you're going to see your technique really take off, and you're going to be able to master some of this like much more difficult stuff. So decreasing difficulty level is one of the things that we want to do in order to decrease our intensity. We can increase the number of breaks that they're getting in class. And I know this sounds like, or seems counterproductive, because I think there's often this idea, whether it's like subconscious or not, that we're like, it's the beginning of the season, I need to kind of get my dancers back into shape. We need to really like bring them back up to speed. Almost, I keep using the like phrase get into shape, and I kind of hate that phrase. So I'm going to say bring up to speed. But the more we can actually build breaks in and gradually increase them, the more productive we are truly going to be. So having a little bit more frequent breaks in class to make sure that we're not overloading them is one way of manipulating the intensity. We can think about really sort of like long, slow, gradual warm-ups in class. The beginning of the season is my favorite time of the year to really focus on that, partly because it allows us to, again, manipulate the intensity and bring the intensity down a little bit when we're thinking about, okay, how do we like really in-depth focus on this warm-up. But I also think it's a really great time of year to focus on those long, slow, gradual warm-ups as a way of dancers tuning back into their body and finding themselves in their body again, focusing on functional movement patterns and basic, like where's their center of gravity over their base of support, all of those types of concepts that we often don't have time to focus on when we are doing more difficult, technical, highly skilled things, or working on choreography or things like that. The beginning of the year, we can really hone in on some of those kind of functional movement patterns, postural patterns, things like that. So we can use those to pull back and decrease the intensity a little bit. And then we also want to really, really think about how much impact we're doing at the beginning of the season. So again, I've already talked a little bit about the response of tendons, especially to impact, but it impacts other parts of our body as well. It's not just tendons. And if we go from doing relatively little impact to huge amounts of impact in a short period of time, the body is generally not going to respond super favorably to that. So we want to really make sure that we're gradually increasing how much impact a dancer is doing in a class. And so we may do very limited amounts of jumping to begin with, and then slowly over the course of those 4 to 6 weeks, increase how much jumping is happening in class. This one is especially tricky when you teach at a studio where there's a lot of different teachers involved. So if you're not the main teacher for a group of dancers, you're teaching perhaps one genre or style of dance, this gets really tricky because a lot of teachers are like, well, we only did, 3 jumping, whatever it is, like exercises across the floor, whatever. We did like 3 jumping things today, 3 jumping combos.
but they might have 4 other classes on that day. And so if they've done, 2 or 3 jumping things in 4 or 5 classes over the course of an evening, that ends up being a lot of impact on their body. So it does require a little bit of coordination with like the teaching teams as a whole to know what are dancers doing in any given day or like over the course of a week, and really making sure that that impact especially is being gradually built up over those 4 to 6 weeks. And it is totally fine to have no impact at all the first week. I promise you, your dancers will survive if they don't jump the first week. They're probably actually going to be like a little bit thankful because their cardiovascular fitness is probably not where they want it to be. And, they're going to be like, oh, that actually felt better in my body. So that's not to say like don't have them jump ever at all, but I promise you it's fine if they don't do it for a week, and we do want to think about that really slow, gradual increase in it to hopefully prevent some of these tendon reaction type injuries that we see. And then on top of that, the preseason is also the time where we want to focus on building up our dance-specific strength and conditioning. And so this is a really great activity as well that we can focus on to kind of decrease the intensity of some of the harder dance-specific skills we're doing, focus more on our dance-specific strength and conditioning. So whether we incorporate that in like warm-ups into class or whether you have separate classes that are specifically focused on that, it doesn't really matter, but it is absolutely the time of year to focus on that. And it is a great way of making sure that their bodies are then prepared for those higher demands of dance. All right, that is what I'm going to say about that. I realize we're already getting a little bit long on time, but I do want to just talk super briefly about the role of preseason screening or preseason assessments, because I got this question recently from a dance teacher who reached out and anyway. So I want to address it really, really briefly. So for those of you who may not be familiar, a preseason screen or a preseason assessment is a way of measuring different physical parameters of a dancer, generally at the beginning of a season. This is very, very, very common in sports and athletics, and especially at elite or professional levels, where they will do testing of, muscular strength, muscular endurance, power output, cardiovascular fitness, like all sorts of different testing. We don't use it as commonly in the dance world, but it is used in some instances. And when we talk about preseason screens or preseason assessments, in my experience, and I'm coming from this as like a physiotherapist, and I'm coming at this as someone who has absolutely done hundreds of preseason screens and assessments over the years and used to have studios that I would, every year annually screen their dancers. We are more often than not looking at, it was more of like a physiotherapy assessment. So we were looking at like posture and alignment and muscle balance and those types of things. And some of the assessment tasks we were doing were objective, like there was measurements involved, but some of them are more subjective in the sense that a lot of what we look at in physio is looking a little bit more subjectively in terms of, like let's say someone's posture. We don't necessarily have objective measures to measure posture per se. What I want to say about preseason screens or assessments is I do think that they can be really, really valuable. However, if we're using them as a one-off and we're doing them only right at the beginning of a season, and then we're never looking at that data again or never reassessing or rescreening these dancers, I don't know how much utility they have. We know from the research that screening does actually not predict injury rates among dancers. So when dancer screening became really popular, there was this idea that hopefully it was going to help us to prevent injuries or to predict injury rates in dancers. And unfortunately, that is not the case. We know that it actually does not help us to predict which dancers will and will not get injured. But again, the type of screening that we're doing is often looking at some of these more subjective data points, and then some of them being a little bit more objective. I think the utility in screening comes more from understanding how a dancer's body is responding to things and where a dancer's body is either like positively adapting or negatively adapting. And in order to understand that, screening needs to happen at more frequent intervals. So if we are regularly screening dancers and using these assessments, and I don't mean like every week, but, perhaps once every 3 months or something like that, and so that we're able to compare data over various points in time, then I think they become much, much, much more useful screening tools. I also think the dance world could be using a lot more objective data and physiological data than it currently is. So I don't think we always collect enough data in terms of things like cardiovascular fitness or people's like resting heart rates or heart rate recovery or those types of things. And those measurements are harder to obtain because we need to have some sort of technology available to us that gives us that information. But as more and more people have wearable technology, whether it's like watches or rings or things like that, this is an area where I think there's room for huge improvement in the dance world, but I also think that data collection needs to be happening more frequently than what it currently is. So that's not to discourage anybody from doing preseason screening, but if we're only ever doing it in the preseason and then never looking at it again, I'm not sure that it is worth the time or the effort necessarily. Maybe it still is. We definitely can use it from a performance enhancement point of view, but just a little bit of food for thought for you if it's something that you've been considering, that perhaps maybe utilizing it in a slightly different way might be more beneficial. The other thing that I will say is sometimes when we're screening people right at the beginning of the year, if they've just had the summer off and haven't been doing anything, it's not giving us super accurate information about them. It's giving us accurate information about where they are in that like snapshot or that moment in time, but that might not tell us where they're at in the middle of the season. So if we want to do some sort of a screening and it's going to be like a one-off where it's just like a moment in time, I'm not sure that preseason is the time to do it. I would argue that maybe slightly later is the time to do it. However, I also think that we need to have it at more frequent intervals throughout the year for it to be more useful. And I think we also need to start to look at what parameters we actually truly are measuring. And again, there are settings in dance that are starting to use some more of these objective measures. So things like force plates and dynamometers and things to actually really truly measure, muscle strength, muscle endurance, power output, things like that. And those are the values that I think are really useful. If we're still using the sort of like more traditional style of maybe a more classic physio assessment, or there might be some like manual muscle testing or a little bit more subjective assessments, that is perhaps a little bit less effective for what we want to use it for in the dance world. So that's all I'm going to say about that. And I just wanted to answer that question because somebody had brought it up and I thought it was a really good point, because this is the time of year that if you're thinking about screening for dancers, it's probably on your mind a little bit, but I think it's an area in the dance world that there's probably some room for improvement. And I would love to see some settings use it maybe a little bit more like sports teams use it. And so they're certainly doing preseason testing, but then they're also testing periodically throughout the season so they can see how their athletes are adapting to, training loads, to competition loads, to travel schedules, to all of that type of thing. So just wanted to mention that. All right, I'm going to wrap things up there. Hopefully that gives you some insight into how you can go into your season and have the strongest start to your season possible so that you're avoiding injury and don't end up at the physio clinic within the first few weeks of the new dance season. That being said, if anybody runs into issues and you are starting to experience pain or you have an injury in the first few weeks of this season, please, 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 please go get it evaluated and assessed and begin treatment as soon as possible, because those injuries that happen right at the beginning of the season, we don't want them dragging on for the duration of the season. So the faster we can get it dealt with at the beginning of the season, the faster you can get back into that sort of part of the season that's going to be really important for your training. So don't ignore things that are happening at the beginning of the season, but if we can slowly and gradually increase our training load over those first 4 to 6 weeks, we're going to mitigate a lot of those injuries that we typically see right at the beginning of the year. Hopefully that has been helpful for you. If you have any questions or want any clarification, please feel free to reach out to me. You can reach me by email or send me a message on social media at Dance Physio Erika. Once again, thank you so much for listening, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.